BioCentury This Week is brought to you by RemeGen Co. RemeGen is a leading biopharmaceutical company in China committed to discovering, developing, and commercializing innovative biologic drugs to address unmet medical needs in patients with autoimmune and ophthalmic diseases and cancer. RemeGen's flagship drug, telitacicept, is a first-in-class BLyS-APRIL dual targeting fusion protein drug that has been launched in China for lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and is in late-stage development for various autoimmune diseases, such as myasthenia gravis, IgA nephropathy, and primary Sjogren's syndrome. RemeGen has research labs and offices across China and the United States.
It's bad out there. So says the majority of respondents to BioCentury's latest sentiment survey, which finds the biotech industry reeling, fearful, and furious about the fallout of tariffs and FDA and NIH policies from the White House. We'll dig into the results of BioCentury's sentiment survey today on the BioCentury This Week podcast. We'll also dissect comments from FDA Commissioner Marty Makary from his first interview since taking the agency's top job, and Trump's executive order calling for the elimination of the pill penalty without saying how it will be done. We'll also discuss how the speed of China's early clinical trials is raising the bar for Western biotechs. I'm Jeff Cranmer, and joining me today on the BioCentury This Week podcast are my colleagues.
Simon Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Steve Usden, Washington Editor.
Selena Koch, Executive Editor.
All right, welcome to the podcast, guys. Simone, tough times for biotech. We wanted to take the pulse of members of industry. We did a poll. It was not an opinion poll on the Trump administration's policies. Rather, it was designed to understand how these policies and the overall environment today are viewed in terms of risks to people's businesses and the broader biopharma industry. Simone, you dug into the numbers. What did you find?
Thank you, Jeff. Well, I think it's really important that you stipulate what we set out to do, which was really to understand where people see their biggest risks and the sentiment in that context. And I thank the three of you on this call for reining me in, because really, when I went through all the comments and all the answers, it was pretty dark out there, to be honest. Normally when we do surveys, we look to say, there's this that's a problem, but on the other hand, here's the rosy picture. There wasn't a lot of that. And I could have almost told you that by the rate at which we got responses from people. So we got altogether 328 responses in a very short time. Just over half of them were from biopharma companies, preclinical, clinical, commercial stage. And over another quarter of them were finance, which is VCs and investment banks and financial advisors. And then the remainder were services. There's a lot of services folk out there, and that sort of includes regulatory consultants and lawyers and, other consultants, CROs and university researchers and so on. And again, just one more thing, about 70% were from the US and another 21% from Europe, and most of the balance from Asia. What can I say? You guys told me that I couldn't go with dark. So I'll try and break it down what they felt, because if you take it away from the comments, and I'll get to the comments, we did categorize the comments. The biggest single concern, which won't surprise anybody, is access to capital, right? So more than 2/3 of the respondents are worried about access to capital. And we gave a range of other choices and some write-in comments for others. But importing drugs and hiring contract manufacturers, profit margins, those are all concerns. Importing drugs a little bit more at 37%, but none of them pales with the concerns about access to capital.
Simone, is this concern about access to capital limited to the US, or were respondents throughout the survey, Europe, Asia, also expressing concerns here?
Well, that's a good question, because actually the question is phrased as the part of your business that's at risk from tariffs, right? And the tariff effect is clearly global. I said it was two-thirds, 67%. Across everybody, if you focus just on finance and biopharma companies, that rises to 73, 75%, but it's global. Whether you're in the US or Europe, among biotechs and investors, 75 to 80% of them are really worried about it. So that means in the US and in Europe as well. This is not something that is limited to the US. I think that won't surprise anybody. We know that the effects of tariffs are global, but I think the idea is that the effect of tariffs on the market markets are global. I'll just go to the next thing and bring Steve in on this because, again, we focused on tariff policies and how much people are concerned about these policy changes in the next 2 years. And if you focus on just very worried and extremely worried, right, pharmaceutical tariffs, more than 60% fall into those categories. Broad tariffs, more than 60%. And international reference pricing, about half, 50%, are either very worried or extremely worried. And Steve, you might want to break that down for us.
Well, I'd say, if 50% of the respondents are very worried or a little bit worried about international reference pricing, then it means that half the people aren't paying attention because because there isn't anybody that's not going to be really seriously affected if the Trump administration imposes international reference pricing in the United States. The United States is the biggest market for pharmaceuticals in the world, and international reference pricing would really slash pricing for any products that are benchmarked against European prices. One thing that actually surprised me a little bit, we asked a question about whether companies, the people who were responding to the survey, believe that the trade associations, bio and pharma, are effectively representing their company's interests in Washington. 62% said no, 38% said yes. I'm not sure if that reflects dissatisfaction with the trade associations as much as dissatisfaction with really what's happening in the policy environment, and people's disappointment that the trade associations haven't been able to create more certainty and more positive news out of Washington than there is. But I think that that's something that's quite important.
Well, one extra point on that front, Steve, is that if you look just in the commercial stage biotechs, 78% of them were dissatisfied. So I can imagine, researchers may not care so much, and maybe some of the consultants or whatever. I actually want to just dig into another thing, which is about FDA. Well, there's two things that sort of from FDA and NIH to FDA policy. So first of all, a really, really huge number is people who think that staffing cuts at FDA are either somewhat negative or very negative. That is over 90%. And in fact, over 80% think they're very negative. The same about cuts to NIH and grant freezing. Immigration policy is a little bit softer at, let's say, only 60%. And ending DEI initiatives in terms of very negative is only 25%, well, 60 overall. But if we go, Steve, into the concerns that people had, top concerns about FDA, the biggest one is about FDA's ability to meet PDUFA deadlines, with like more than 60% either very worried or extremely worried about that. I'll go through some of the others, but you might give a little bit of interpretation on this. Other big concerns was their ability to clear INDs, issue guidances, company interactions, inspections of facilities, and negotiating renewal. More than 50% are either very worried or extremely worried about all of those.
And as they should be. I spoke with former FDA acting commissioner Janet Woodcock and longtime head of CDER this morning for a story that I'm writing that's going to come out hopefully today or tomorrow. And one of the things that she pointed out, she said, FDA makes thousands of decisions every day, and many of them are really important for the public health. Many of them are really important for the fates of companies that are trying to develop drugs. And if there isn't confidence that the organizational structure is right there isn't confidence that they have the right staffing, then either decisions don't get made, or they get made wrong, or people don't know that they've been made, and those things have consequences. So people who are worried about what's happening at FDA, I think, are right to be worried about FDA. About NIH, again, there's concerns both about what's already happened, the freezing of grants and cuts to NIH, and there should be even more concern, I think, about what's going to happen. The plans that have been leaked from HHS for a $20 billion cut next year in NIH funding mean that the kind of the future, the groundwork, the fundamental research that the whole industry is based on is going to be cut back, enormously. That's definitely going to have consequences going forward.
So before we move on, I think it's worth pausing on this for just a sec, because I know the survey is big and there's a lot of different policies we ask people to weigh in on. But we've done a lot of surveys over the years at BioCentury, and this is the closest to a unanimous response to a question that I think we've seen. Like almost the entire industry is united on being very worried about FDA and NIH.
And the thing that's interesting about the NIH is the industry's worried about it. When I speak to CEOs who are on the boards of the two trade associations and to lobbyists around Washington, to the Washington offices of some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies, they are not really speaking out about NIH. That's frustrated people who are at NIH who've contacted me. That's frustrated some of the people I've spoken with who are at the smaller biotechs that really rely most heavily and most directly on NIH. But the industry has really taken the viewpoint that there are things that they have to prioritize, and NIH funding isn't one of them. And I think that that's one of the things from this survey that the trade associations and the lobbyists in Washington might take from it is that people out there are really concerned.
Right. I wanted to ask you about that, Steve, because there's a couple other things I want to come back to in the survey. Jeff, maybe talk us through the China data in a minute, or the views on China in a minute. But just on this issue, we had it when we collected the general comments. Quite a few of them suggested industry leaders should be speaking up more. A couple did mention bio and pharma. Are you saying, Steve, that those trade organizations and maybe those lobbyists don't really have the finger on the pulse of what their constituents care about?
Well, I think at least in this respect, they don't.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think that also it's not just on the trade associations. I think actually it's probably more on the CEOs, especially the CEOs of the big companies. They're the ones who have the bully pulpit. They're the ones, honestly, who have Donald Trump's ear. And the fact that they're not speaking out on this. Look, one of the big reasons that Kennedy was confirmed as HHS secretary was that members of Congress believed that industry's silence on this signaled consent, and I think that industry's silence, at least their public silence, maybe they're speaking out privately, but industry's public silence about what's happening to NIH, I think it also signals to members of Congress and to the White House that this isn't an industry concern. And I think that that's a mistake.
All right. Well, Simone, you mentioned China. The survey found that there is broad concern that a souring of relations between Washington and Beijing will impede biotech, really across all correspondents. 83% said that they were concerned that U.S.-China relations will affect their ability to develop drugs. Commercial biopharmas, maybe not surprisingly, are the most alarmed. 96% of those who answered in the yes group, 83% clinical, 89% preclinical answered yes, 80% of investors answered yes. Non-biopharmas, that's your CROs, your service plays and the like, still 78% yes responses there. Simone, anything else you picked up on in those responses around China?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you break it down, the most common concerns, what people did was they had a write-in field, and we took those write-in comments and categorized them. And the most common ones were really around manufacturing and supply chain and access to CROs, a lot of concerns around that. But there's also a lot of concern about innovation. Some people said it would hurt Chinese innovation. Some people said it would hurt US innovation. Some people said it would help innovation in Europe and Asia. And some people said it would hurt innovation everywhere. But people are looking at this through the lens of what does it mean for innovation.
I think what's interesting here is that there's really a fundamental disconnect, I think, between policymakers in Washington and the biopharma industry. I wrote about this last week, and I think it was last week, I can't even remember now. And I did a BioCentury show interview with the vice chair of the congressionally chartered commission that looked at security threats associated with biotechnology. Really, the consensus among policymakers in Washington is that the United States has to disengage with China, and that engagement with China in the life sciences poses national security threats to the United States. I think the consensus in the biopharma industry is that the two industries are integrated, they're becoming increasingly integrated, they're interdependent, and they're mutually reinforcing. There are concerns about supply chain resiliency. I think there's a consensus about the benefits of reshoring manufacturing to the United States. But in terms of accessing innovation, in terms of the ability of Chinese companies to provide manufacturing and research services to U.S. companies, a lot of the small U.S. companies believe that access to Chinese companies is a force multiplier, that they get access to the kind of manufacturing and development excellence that the big companies already have. The big companies look at China as a place to source innovation and to do R&D. This is a fundamental disconnect with the way that the White House and Congress look at the U.S.-China relationship in life sciences. And I think that there's going to be a bumpy road going forward because of that.
Yeah, Steve, I'm sure we're going to continue to discuss that because the road isn't going to get less bumpy. Jeff, I think you want to go to a break in a few minutes, but let me just wrap up because some of the things you said, Steve, are broader than just the China relationship. So we did allow people to have write-in comments, and we got a large number of write-in comments. Again, we categorized them. I'm just going to say that 93% of them were negative. Okay, and the other 7% were not positive. They were either neutral or positive. So, but let me just wrap up, at a high level, some of those ideas. So the negative comments. This is why, Jeff, I appreciate that you started out by pointing out this was not an opinion poll, right, about the administration, but many people tied directly Trump's policies to the demise of biotech for some people, and certainly to consequences that are long-term negative for the industry. It really seems that many people have a firm belief that biopharma is a global enterprise and that it is stronger because of those global connections. Tariffs, other geopolitical stresses, the China things you've talked about, are seen as interrupting that dynamic, and that is seen as long-term negative for the industry. There is also a fear for the innovation ecosystem. We've talked about FDA, but the idea that NIH-funded research is fundamental, and that's a pretty global view. There may be opportunities in Europe, say some people, but most people think that defunding US research is bad for global biotech. If you want the positive comments, and literally there were two, one said, look, I know it's bad now, but long term, this is going to be good for drug development and efficiencies in hospitals and clinics. And another felt that less regulation would be beneficial for clinical research and would reduce costs and timelines. So I want to stipulate to those two. But, overall, I think, maybe we're going to have to do a little bit more you can help me, Selena, figure out what the right time period is to let this rest and see if things change or get better. But, at the moment, there's a pretty big feeling that the US preeminence in biomedical science is in threat. And that part of that is through the tariffs and various other activities is the international trust of the US as a partner is feeding into our industry in that way.
Yeah, in the BioCentury Show interview that Steve mentioned, Michelle Rozo talked about the results of a report. That report said, and importantly, that report was completed at the end of last year, said that China was about 2 or 3 years away from overtaking US biotech. And now this. Okay, now you can click on the link in the show notes to find the results of the survey. It's an awesome PDF deck that you can download. You can also go to biocenturysurveyresults.com. We're going to cut to a quick break and then we'll be back with the latest on FDA and drug pricing policy out of the White House.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Grand Rounds. BioCentury's R&D conference will return in 2025 to the US and Europe to debate key bottlenecks in translation and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us in Chicago this June after ASCO for the second BioCentury Grand Rounds US, and in Cambridge, UK this September for the inaugural Grand Rounds Europe. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
New FDA Commissioner Marty Makary gave his first interview last week with the Megyn Kelly Show. They discussed advisory committees, a new pathway for approval of ultra-rare drugs. And also last week, we'll get to this in a minute, President Trump issued an executive order calling for the elimination of the pill penalty under the Inflation Reduction Act. Steve, what did you glean from Makary's comments in his first interview?
The overall tenor of it was to say that he views FDA's history of drug regulation and food regulation as highly problematic, and that he believes that big changes need to be made. He talked about advisory committee meetings. He said that when he came to FDA, he was, quote, shocked, quote, to learn that employees of big pharma companies sit on FDA advisory committees as members of those committees. Honestly, I was shocked that he was shocked about that. Anybody that's listened to an advisory committee meeting for the last 25 years knows that there are non-voting industry representatives on those committees. The reason that they're on there is because in 1997, Congress passed a law and said that FDA has to put non-voting industry representatives on committees. Makary said that he's going to eliminate the presence of pharmaceutical company representatives on advisory committees where it's statutorily possible. So it's not clear exactly what that's going to mean, because it looks like for drug and biologics advisory committees, it is statutorily required. Maybe they'll find a way around that. But I think what's more important is the kind of the tenor of the remarks that he made. Is basically, he said flat out, he said that FDA has been corrupted by industry in the past, and he cited the presence of industry representatives on advisory committees as an example of that corruption. I think that's fundamentally wrong. I've listened to a lot of advisory committee meetings over the years, probably hundreds. I've never seen an industry representative tip the balance in favor or against recommending approval of a particular drug. And I think that there are a lot of problems with advisory committees. I've written about this in the past, and the system really does need to be reformed. I'm not sure that kicking industry representatives off is the place where I would go for that.
Okay, well, as our survey said, right, people are very, very worried about FDA, but not all news coming out of the agency is necessarily bad. Some of the ideas put forward might even be called good. So there's a mixed picture. Maybe we can talk about a pathway for ultra-rare diseases.
Yeah, and look, what Dr. Makary did was lay out at a very high level a pathway for reviewing drugs that are intended to treat very, very rare conditions. So we don't know exactly what he's got in mind, but the rare disease community was thrilled by what he said. He said that, quote, we're going to be rolling out a new pathway for drugs, which is a pathway based on a plausible mechanism. And those drugs would be for ultra-rare conditions. And he gave the example of a condition that affects only 75 people worldwide, and said that basically it may not be possible to conduct a randomized controlled trial, but people who have those conditions still need to have drugs that can help them and hopefully even cure them. And he intends to do that. Those remarks were consistent with things that the rare disease community and the companies that are trying to develop drugs for very, very rare diseases have been saying for a long time. They're also consistent with things that former FDA employees, Janet Woodcock, who I mentioned earlier, Patricia Cavazzoni, the former head of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, has also called for the creation of an ultra-rare pathway. So now the question is, what exactly does he mean by it? How's it going to be done? He didn't specify that. One of the really big divides among advocates of an ultra-rare pathway is whether it should be done through legislation or whether FDA can do it on its own. He seemed to suggest that FDA is going to do it on its own. And then there are, of course, a lot of questions about how it will be done, what will be the standards, and I think most important maybe, how it will be, what will be the guardrails around whatever's done so that basically the lowering of standards, because that's what it's going to be, doesn't affect all drugs. It doesn't affect drugs outside of this narrow band of drugs for extremely rare diseases.
Now, extremely rare diseases are often, not always, but they're often genetic, right? And so this is a place where gene therapies can really shine. So if you're talking about a plausible mechanism of action, the thing that comes most readily to mind that would be like the most direct relationship between the therapy and the disease mechanism is you have a gene, it's broken. There's loss of function, there's gain of function, and your therapy directly intervenes in that. And we've seen some examples of this already where FDA has been willing to have some regulatory flexibility, but what something like this would do if it, is implemented well, would create some firmer lines and say these carve it out in more explicit ways and say these are the areas where you can do this. And
I should say there's also a concern that it's not going to be done like that. There's a concern among some in the rare disease community that what he's talking about is reviving an idea that was mooted in legislation last year, the Promising Pathway Act, which wasn't enacted. And in that act, basically, it said drugs that have had a phase 1 trial and have some other small amount of data that are intended to treat serious or life-threatening conditions would be able to get a conditional approval. And FDA and some patient advocates expressed a great deal of concern about that. They pointed out that there are an awful lot of drugs that had good data from phase 1 trials, had good data from a preliminary trial after that, and then in phase 3 were determined not to be effective or not to be safe. There are some patient advocacy groups, however, who supported the Promising Pathway Act. ALS advocacy groups were prominent in supporting the bill. So there's a concern about the details. Really, what is it that Commissioner Makary intends to do here? Hopefully, we'll be finding out soon.
Steve, this executive order, break that down for us.
Look, there's a lot in it. We don't have enough time to do everything that was in that executive order. Two things that stand out. One, it puts the Trump administration on record as saying that they want to eliminate the so-called pill penalty in the Medicare drug price negotiation program. The pill penalty, as most of our listeners know, I think, is a provision that allows Medicare to negotiate prices of small molecule drugs after they've been on the market for 9 years and biologics after they've been on the market for 13 years. The interesting thing is that the executive order is quite vague. It says it wants to eliminate the pill penalty. Advocates for industry say, oh, that means that the 9 years for small molecules is going to go up to 13 years for biologics. I've spoken with other people who were concerned that it might not mean that at all. It might mean that the period for biologics is reduced, and it might mean that the period for small molecules is increased and they meet somewhere in the middle at 11 or at 12 years. That would obviously create winners and losers. Companies that are dependent on small molecules would win. Companies that have portfolios that are heavily weighted toward biologics would lose. The other thing to think about that's in the executive order on the pill penalty is it says that it has to be budget neutral. So how the Congressional Budget Office scores whatever proposals are made in Congress to do this will be critically important. And then there's the question of what's the vehicle for it going to be. Industry advocates are hoping that they can get this into budget reconciliation legislation. That could be challenging because it would only take a handful of members of Congress to oppose it, to make that impossible. They're hoping that President Trump's strong support for eliminating the pill penalty will overcome resistance among some conservatives in Congress who might believe that this is a giveaway to the pharmaceutical industry.
Steve, what about international reference pricing?
So international reference pricing is not specifically mentioned in the executive order, and not a lot of people have picked up on this, but I believe that it really sets the stage for the Trump administration to reintroduce what President Trump called most favored nation in his first administration. There's a provision in the executive order for CMS's Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation to do a pilot project to create lower prices for drugs and biologics, including drugs and biologics that are not covered by the Medicare drug pricing negotiation program. So the way that it's described in the order, it really fits international reference pricing quite closely, even though it doesn't specifically mention it. So I think that this is really a heads up that this is a direction that the Trump administration is planning to go.
Okay, and you can check out Steve's flurry of stories on biocenturypodcast.com or click on the various links that I will drop into the show notes. We talked a bit about China biotech a little bit earlier on the pod. If you're a regular listener, this will be no surprise to you. China's biotechs are raising their profile on the global stage. And they may have cracked one of the key bottlenecks for both speeding up and de-risking early drug development. That is the ability to test compounds in humans and fast. Simone, you talked to a number of people to get the inside word on just how this is happening. What did you find out?
Well, actually, Jeff, thank you for that. This really closes the circle on a few of the things we've talked about today. The China interface, Steve, you've talked about what FDA is doing and the regulatory pathway, but I think it's also part of the competitive landscape, because something that we hear over and over again is the way that China researchers can conduct at least early clinical trials much faster than in the West. And that has driven a lot of the NewCo model that you've been covering, Jeff, where investors license assets from China or Asia to create new companies in the West, and also a bunch of East-West deals that do the same. And almost all of those, certainly the NewCo companies, are based on assets that have clinical data. And, we did talk to Warder Joustra and Alice Vickers from Forbion, who had invested in two NewCos, Iolos, if I'm saying that right, which ended up getting bought by GSK, and Verdiva, an obesity play. And in fact, the China clinical data was really relevant. And Alice talked, in fact, about the biomarker data that they got in those clinical trials that really gave them a lot more confidence that the asset would play out in phase 3.
So really, Simone, what did you find out? What, is there a secret sauce? Is there something that is happening in China that allows Chinese companies to complete clinical trials more rapidly than in the rest of the world? And is it something that the United States and Europe can learn from?
Two quick answers to that, Steve. Learn from, yes. Secret sauce, though, not much they can do about. The real secret sauce is they have a huge population advantage. But it doesn't end there, okay? So what we did is we broke it down. If you think about from INDs, which are pretty similar now in China, it's a little bit faster in the US. It's a 1 month, 30 days, China 60 to 90 days. And then we broke down all the stages of the study startup, and they're really very similar. They're similar processes. The timelines are not very different. Net, from there to actually recruiting patients is pretty similar. And I think that's important because a lot of people tend to think that it's easier or the data are less good in China or something. There's no corners being cut. It's the same pathway that they have to go through because the China FDA has really raised standards in the last 10 years and come online with what international regulations are. But the population difference is not only that there's just a much bigger population in China. So bigger population means more patients. Many of them have moved to the East Coast of China where there are these huge hospitals. So many patients are concentrated in a smaller geographic area that makes recruitment easier. They have an integrated healthcare system, which makes it easier to identify patients and contact them. Something in terms of learning, Steve, apparently they use digital technologies a lot, apps and so on, for site recruitment. That is quite a big factor. And also, I think the state of healthcare, the fact that many have moved from rural areas, maybe some patients are more willing to, or it's easier for them to engage in the clinical trial enterprise than it is. So, a CAR T or a trial or something like that, maybe there are fewer barriers for patients to actually learn about it and engage with it. So there are bits within that beyond just the population differences. These are conversations we had with Novotech, which is a which is a CRO operating in China, Keidia, which is another CRO that gave us a very detailed breakdown of the timelines, and then Charles River Labs, who also talked to us. And, obviously Charles River is global. So I think it was an interesting way to dig into this and understand what the real differences are. There are lessons for people in the West, but one of them There's one company we know of so far that's done it. There may be others. A Belgian company, Biotech, that has chose to do its trials in China, its very first clinical trials in China. And then that company on the back of those trials did a big deal with AstraZeneca.
Yeah, so just to summarize, like what I took away from the story is the time it takes to clear an IND and start a trial is not that much different, really. The source of China's speed is more about bringing down barriers to recruitment. And because they have such a big pool of patients there and they're well situated near trial sites, the main thing that I feel like I keep hearing is that the pool of assets that have some amount of de-risking in the clinic, even if it's a little, is just growing and growing and growing. So it's just it's a bigger pond to fish in now, right? If you're a company who's out there looking for an asset that's has some de-risking, that's a big pond to fish in compared to what it used to be.
Okay, well, Simone mentioned Biotech. We have our BioEquity Europe, the 25th BioEquity Europe coming up in mid-May in Belgium. And one of the many, many panels and several fireside chats will have the CEO of Biotech, that's Jean-Pierre Laterre. He'll be in conversation with Simone. If you're looking for a BioCentury conference that's a little more Midwestern, we have BioCentury's Grand Rounds coming up conveniently in Chicago right after ASCO. And that conference, it's at the interface of academia and biotech. It's going to be, as my colleague Karen Tkach-Tusman called it last week, a Geekchella. But since it's in Chicago, maybe we should call it a Geekapalooza. You can find out more information at BioCentury Grand Rounds. Sign up, join in. If you're a presenting company that wants to present at Grand Rounds, reach out to me directly. Simone, Steve, Selena, thanks as always. Cole, appreciate you in the background doing our production work. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. Hope everyone had a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury this week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education. And for our Boston listeners, happy Patriot Day. I know that Red Sox game started early for folks, and we'll have to wait to see who ends up winning the Boston Marathon. Apparently the race is celebrating the 250th anniversary of the start of the Revolutionary War and following in the hoofsteps of Paul Revere and his horse.
BioCentury would like to thank RemeGen for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about RemeGen's products and pipelines, you can go to www.remegen.com.